Picture this, 7 in the morning, the boardroom at Voss Meridian still smelling like burnt coffee and waxed oak, and Thomas Reed standing there in his old work boots while Victor Voss leaned back in that leather chair like he owned the air itself. "This delay is nothing but a billing grab," Victor said, loud enough for every man and woman at the table to hear. "You're done here, Reed. Pack your papers and go." Now you have to understand something about that moment. Eleanor Voss, 52, and running the company her father built, had just watched her own uncle fire the one man who knew the dam was lying. She had no idea yet that Thomas Reed carried the only proof that could bring Victor down, or that the same family name had tangled their lives together long before any of them sat in that room. What none of them could see was how a single old photograph was about to turn everything around. Day one started quiet enough. Thomas had driven up from the old lakeside road just after dawn, his truck still carrying the faint scent of motor oil and pine needles from the trip. He came prepared with the spillway readings, the ones that didn't match the sensors any honest engineer would trust. Silver Creek Dam was set to open in 7 days, and those gates needed another month at least. But Victor had called the meeting to push the schedule, and Eleanor sat at the head of the table with her father's watch on her wrist, the one that ticked a little louder than the room wanted to admit. Thomas laid the papers out flat. "The pressure logs are off by 20% on gate 3. Someone changed the calibration after the last inspection." Victor smiled the way a man smiles when he's already decided the facts don't matter. He wore a navy suit that cost more than Thomas's truck, a gold watch chain visible at the cuff, and he tapped one polished shoe against the table leg while he spoke. "We've got state sign-off. We've got deadlines. What we've got is an overpaid safety man looking for another invoice." Eleanor didn't speak right away. She looked at the papers, then at her uncle, then at Thomas. 40 years in construction had taught her to read a room before she read the numbers, and this room had already made up its mind. She reached for the phone on the side table. "I'm suspending the contract effective this morning," she said, her voice steady but tired around the edges. "We'll review the findings and get back to you." Thomas didn't argue. He gathered the papers slowly, the way a man does when he's done this before. His wallet slipped from his coat pocket when he stood, landing face up on the carpet. The photograph inside slid halfway out, an 8-year-old girl in a faded red sweater standing by a lakeside cabin. On the back, in careful handwriting, were the words, "When she's strong enough, the truth comes home." Eleanor saw it before he could pick it up. She didn't say anything at first, just watched him slide the photo back inside the worn leather. That was the first crack in the day. Later, alone in her office with the door closed, she picked up the phone and asked the records clerk for a quiet check on Thomas Reed's file. The report came back clean except for one gap, 27 years wide, and it lined up with the night her mother had driven out in a storm looking for answers about a flooded farm. Thomas waited for her outside the old greenhouse on the edge of the property, the one with the cracked glass and the rusted hinges. When she walked up, he didn't waste time. "I was 12, he said. "Found you on the Ridge Road that night. Carried you to the ranger cabin and kept the fire going till your father came." The greenhouse smelled like damp earth and old tomato vines, and Eleanor listened without interrupting. Victor had opened the floodgate to force a holdout farmer off his land, then blamed the Reed family when the water took the wrong house. The records were gone, but the story wasn't. Thomas pulled a small metal sensor from his pocket, the kind they used on the old dam before the new one was built. They tampered with these the same way they're doing now. Same pattern. Same order from the same man. He set it on the workbench between them. Eleanor turned it over once, felt the weight of it, and knew the fight had only just started. That greenhouse door creaked shut behind them, and Thomas slipped the sensor back into his coat like it was nothing more than loose change. Eleanor kept the photo's words turning in her head. When she's strong enough, the truth comes home. She didn't ask him who the girl was. Not yet. The damp earth smell followed them out to the ridge road where the old tire tracks still showed from that storm night 27 years ago. The next morning, 6 days before the county board would sign off on the new dam permits, Thomas showed up at the records annex with a thermos and 2 paper cups. He poured the coffee black and set 1 cup on the counter without a word. Eleanor had already pulled the floodgate logs from '97, the ones Victor's people claimed were lost in a basement flood of their own. The paper smelled like mildew and copier toner. They worked side by side at a folding table under the fluorescent hum, matching the sensor readings Thomas had pulled from the ranger station archives. Every timestamp lined up with the night the water took the Reed place and left Eleanor's family farm standing. Around 10, the annex door opened and one of Victor's assistants walked in, the one with the pressed wool overcoat and the company lapel pin. He nodded at Eleanor the way a man nods when he thinks he still owns the room. "Just checking on the permit timeline," he said. Thomas kept his head down, turning pages one at a time the way a man does when he's already read them 100 times in his own mind. The assistant left without looking twice at the table. By noon they had a pattern, 3 separate tampering entries, each one signed off by the same hand that now sat on the permit committee. Thomas folded the last sheet and slid it into his pocket. "We show this to the right person, the signatures won't hold," he said. Eleanor watched the way his fingers lingered on the edge of the paper, the same careful way he'd handled the photograph the day before. They split up after that. Thomas drove out to the old ranger cabin to pull the original weather logs. Eleanor stayed behind to copy what they had. That's when the mini-crisis landed. The copy machine jammed on page 4, and while she was clearing the rollers the assistant walked back in, this time without knocking. He stood in the doorway long enough to see the floodgate file open on the table. "Victor asked me to remind you the board prefers clean copies," he said, and the words sat in the air like a warning. Eleanor smiled the polite smile she'd learned from her mother and told him they'd be finished by end of day. He left, but she heard his shoes pause outside the window before the car door shut. Thomas called from the cabin at 2. The line crackled the way rotary phones used to in bad weather. "Found the backup sensor log," he said. "It's got the same gap as the one in my pocket, only this one still has the serial number." Eleanor wrote the number down on the back of an old envelope, the same envelope that now held the photograph she'd slipped into her purse that morning. The girl in the red sweater looked out from the faded print like she already knew how this would end. They met again at dusk by the greenhouse, the sensor between them on the workbench once more. Thomas turned it over and pointed to the tiny scratch on the casing. "That's from my pocket knife the night I pulled it out of the water. Kept it all these years because I figured someone would need to see it again." Eleanor felt the weight of it the same way she had the day before, only now the weight carried the sound of the cracked glass panes and the smell of old tomato vines. The countdown sat in her chest like a second heartbeat, 5 days left before the board met, 5 days to turn those signatures into something the whole county could read. Thomas didn't push for an answer. He just waited, the way a man waits when he's already carried one burden across 27 winters. Outside, the ridge road darkened, and the first stars showed above the cabin where a 12-year-old boy had kept a fire going until help arrived. The photo stayed in Eleanor's purse, the note on the back still unread by anyone but the 2 of them who already knew what it meant. The next morning came with a knock that didn't sound like Thomas. Eleanor was at the kitchen table, the envelope open again, the photo of the girl in the red sweater laid flat beside the sensor serial number she'd copied down the night before. She slipped everything back inside before she opened the door. Victor's assistant stood there in a pressed coat that didn't belong on a ridge road, clipboard in hand. "Just a courtesy check," he said. "Victor wants to know if the revised copies are ready. He mentioned the board meeting in 4 days now, not 5. The words landed like a small door closing. Eleanor kept her voice even and said she'd have what they needed. He left without stepping inside, but she saw his eyes flick toward the workbench where the censor still sat under a folded cloth. Thomas arrived an hour later with coffee in a thermos and another page from the old cabin logs. "This one's dated the same week," he said. "The gap matches. And the name on the bottom? It's the one we left out of the official record back then." Eleanor read it once, then again, the letters pulling at something she'd carried since the boy was 12 and the fire had eaten half the back wall. She didn't say the name out loud yet. Instead she asked Thomas if he'd eaten. He had not. They split the coffee on the porch steps while the ridge light climbed the pines, and she told him the story in pieces the way she told it to no one else for 27 years. By midday the mini-crisis arrived in the form of a phone call from the county clerk's office. Someone had requested the archived Water District file for the old property, the same file that still carried the censor purchase order with Eleanor's late husband's signature. The clerk sounded polite but firm. "We can't release it without the current owner's consent," he said. "And the name on the deed is still listed under the company Victor represents." Eleanor hung up and sat with the receiver in her hand until the rotary click settled. Thomas waited on the other side of the table. "We go to the courthouse tomorrow," she said. "One more signature. One more day." That afternoon they walked the greenhouse rows again, the smell of damp earth and tomato vines thick around them. Thomas pulled the tarp from a second sensor unit he'd kept in storage since the original installation. The scratch pattern matched. The serial number filled the gap on the envelope. Eleanor felt the weight of the photo through the purse strap on her shoulder, the girl in the red sweater watching both of them without saying what came next. 4 days left. The board would want clean copies. They had 4 days to make the copies tell the truth the county had never read out loud. Thomas didn't ask for promises. He just nodded toward the ridge road where the first truck of the evening was climbing the grade, and they went back inside before the light faded. The envelope stayed on the table now, the photo face up so the note on the back could be read whenever either of them needed reminding of what the 12-year-old boy had written the night the cabin stayed warm. The next morning arrived with a thin frost on the porch rail and 3 days left on the clock. Eleanor woke before the light and sat at the kitchen table, turning the envelope so the girl's red sweater caught the first slant of sun through the window. The note on the back still held the same careful block letters the boy had used that night, no date, just the promise that the censors would keep the pipes from freezing again. Thomas knocked once and came in with the truck keys. They drove the ridge road without talking much, the envelope riding between them on the seat. At the courthouse the clerk behind the counter knew her name but wouldn't meet her eyes when she asked for the Water District release. "Victor Lang already filed an objection," the woman said, tapping a fresh sheet of paper. "He says the signature on the original purchase order doesn't match the current deed. Needs verification from the company office before anything moves." Eleanor felt the words land the way they always did, quiet, polite, and final. Thomas stayed at her shoulder. "We can wait," he told the clerk. "We'll wait right here until someone checks the microfiche." They took the bench by the window. Eleanor kept the envelope in her lap. She didn't open it again, she just let her thumb find the worn corner where the photo had been folded once too often. An hour passed. Then another. The clerk came back with a different form and a look that said she was stretching rules she wasn't supposed to touch. "The archive shows the order went through under the old holding company," she said. "But the name on the carbon is still yours from before the transfer. Sign here and we'll log it for the board meeting." Eleanor signed. The pen scratched the same way it had on the greenhouse ledger the day her husband had brought the first censor home. When the stamp came down, the clerk slid a copy across the counter and lowered her voice. "Lang's people called twice this morning. They wanted the file pulled. I told them the request had to come through proper channels." Thomas nodded once, the only thanks that fit the room. They drove back with the new paper tucked inside the envelope, against the photo. The road curved past the old orchard where the frost had already burned off. Eleanor asked Thomas if he remembered the first winter the cabin held heat all night. He did. Neither of them said Victor's name. The sun had dropped behind the ridge by the time they reached the house, and the phone was ringing again, county again, this time about a second request for the same file. Eleanor let it ring twice before she picked up. "Tell him the copies are already made," she said. "And the board will see the original signature tomorrow. 2 days left now." They spent the evening at the table again, the envelope open, the note face up where the light could reach it. Thomas made coffee. Eleanor read the boy's words once more without saying them out loud. The rotary phone stayed silent the rest of the night. The next morning came up clear and sharp, the kind that made the windows rattle just a little when the wind caught them right. Eleanor stood at the sink with the envelope still between her hands, thumb working that same worn corner like it had last night. 2 days left, she'd said, and now it was down to 1 full day plus whatever the board meeting would leave them. Thomas poured the coffee without asking how she wanted it. He already knew. "You have to understand something about mornings on that place. They moved slow, but they never stayed quiet long. The phone started in at 8 sharp, same as yesterday. This time it wasn't the county clerk. It was a junior from Lang's office, voice all polished edges, saying Victor needed the original carbon before the board sat down." Eleanor listened, then set the receiver down gentle enough that it didn't click. She turned to Thomas. "They want the paper that proves the holding company still answers to the old ledger. We already gave them the copy." That was the first small pressure of the day, and it didn't land. Thomas drove out to the north field to check the sensor lines his father had run 20 years back, the ones nobody in Lang's crowd had ever bothered to map. While he was gone the envelope stayed on the table, open but not touched again. The note inside caught a slant of light when the sun moved, the boy's handwriting still clear after all this time. By 10 the second call came, this one from the board secretary herself. She sounded tired more than anything, like she'd been fielding the same request from 2 directions. "Eleanor, Victor's asking if there's any prior claim he's missed. The file they pulled yesterday shows your name, but he wants confirmation the transfer went clean." Eleanor didn't raise her voice. She just asked if the secretary still had the greenhouse log from '87, the one with the handwritten censor notes. The woman on the other end went quiet for a moment, then said she'd check. When she called back 20 minutes later her tone had shifted. "That log matches the holding company records. Your signature's on the first page." Thomas came in from the field right then, tracking a little dirt across the threshold. He saw the envelope and didn't say anything, just nodded once the way he had at the archive. The reversal was small, the kind nobody outside the room would notice right away, but it held. Lang's people had pulled the wrong thread, and now the board had a fresh line back to the original work. They spent the afternoon at the table again, the envelope between them. Eleanor read the note to herself, not out loud, the way she'd done every evening since it arrived. The photo stayed face down this time, but its corner still showed under the paper. Thomas fixed the hinge on the back door that had been sticking since fall. Neither one mentioned the auction house downstate or the number on the calendar. The house stayed quiet except for the occasional creak of the old floorboards. By evening the day counter had moved without them marking it. 19 hours now until the board sat. The rotary phone rang once more, late, and this time it was the clerk from the archive again. She kept her voice low. Lang's office tried the microfiche room after hours. "I logged the attempt. Thought you should know." Eleanor thanked her, then hung up and looked at Thomas across the table. "They're getting nervous," she said. He didn't answer, just moved the envelope an inch so the light wouldn't hit the note so hard. They turned in early, the envelope closed but not put away. The night settled the same way the one before had, with the wind off the ridge and the sensors out in the field clicking their quiet readings. One day left, and the paper inside that envelope still hadn't been read where anyone else could hear it. One day left, and the wind kept pushing at the ridge like it had business there. Eleanor woke before the sensors did, the envelope still at the center of the table where she'd left it. The corner of the photo showed no more than it had the night before, but the handwriting on the note had started to feel heavier somehow, the way an old tool belt does when you pick it up after years off the hook. Thomas put the kettle on without asking. He still hadn't opened the thing, and she hadn't asked him to. That was how they worked now, same as it had been since the first letter came. The phone stayed quiet until after sunrise. When it rang, it was the same clerk from the archive, only this time her voice carried a different weight. Lang's assistant called the county recorder's office at 8 sharp, she said. They wanted the original filing dates on the sensor patents. I told them the microfiche log was already with the board clerk. That seemed to slow them down. Eleanor thanked her the same way she always did, plain and steady, then set the receiver back in its cradle. Thomas looked up from the hinge he'd been tightening again, the one that had never quite held since the frost came early last fall. He gave that same single nod, the one that said he heard the thread pulling tighter without needing the words said out loud. They ate breakfast the way they always had, simple and quiet, with the envelope still between them. Every so often Eleanor would touch the edge of it, not to open it but just to feel the paper give a little under her fingers. The note inside was the one she'd written in ballpoint the week the prototype first worked, back when the field out back was nothing but scraped dirt and the idea still felt like it might break if you looked at it too hard. Nobody at the board table had seen that version yet. Lang's people had the polished reports, the ones with the company letterhead and the later signatures, but the raw log was still Eleanor and Thomas's alone. By mid-morning the day counter had slipped another notch. 18 hours now. Thomas went out to check the sensors the way he checked them twice a day, rain or shine, because that was the habit that had kept the readings honest all these years. Eleanor stayed at the table and read the note once more to herself, the same lines she'd been carrying since the envelope arrived. She didn't need to say them aloud. The words were already part of the room the same way the creak in the floorboards was. The next call came at lunch. It wasn't the clerk this time. It was the board secretary, a younger woman who'd started after the original papers were filed. Her tone was careful, the kind you use when you're not sure who else might be listening. The agenda packet went out this morning, she said. Lang added an item about reassigning the holding company asset if the vote goes his way. Eleanor didn't answer right away. She just held the receiver and let the silence sit. When the secretary spoke again, her voice had softened. The sensor log you sent yesterday, it's attached as Exhibit 3. I made sure the page numbers lined up with the old filings. After they hung up, Thomas came back in with dirt on his boots and a new reading sheet in his hand. He set it next to the envelope without comment. The numbers matched the ones on the note inside. That was the small reversal again, the kind that didn't announce itself but stayed in the room all the same. Afternoon brought a new tension, the kind that settled in the joints the way an old injury does before a storm. The mail carrier left a certified letter on the step, the envelope this time from Lang's office. Thomas brought it in, set it beside the first one, and went back to the hinge. He didn't ask what it said. Eleanor turned it over once, felt the weight of the seal, and left it unopened. The photo corner still peeked out from under the handwritten note, the same way it had every day since the package came. By supper the clock had moved again. 16 hours to the board meeting now. The rotary phone stayed quiet through the meal, but the wind picked up and the sensors clicked a little louder than usual, like they were counting the hours down with the rest of the house. Thomas moved the envelope an inch closer to the lamp so the light wouldn't catch the ink so hard. Neither one of them said the auction house name out loud, but it sat there between them anyway, the way it had since the first reversal had started to show itself in the archive logs. The night came on slow, same as the one before, with the ridge wind and the quiet readings and the envelope still closed but not put away. The wind rattled the old sash window that night the way it had for 40 winters, and Eleanor sat with the envelope still unopened on the table beside the rotary phone. You could hear the sensors clicking every so often through the wall, their faint mechanical heartbeat carrying the same readings Thomas had checked that afternoon. The numbers on his sheet matched the ones she had sent the secretary, same as they had for 3 days running now. 16 hours to the board meeting, and the envelope kept its corner of photo and note visible under the lamp. Morning came with a new piece of trouble. The mail carrier brought a second certified letter before breakfast, this one thinner, the return address printed in the clean block letters Lang favored on all his office correspondence. Thomas set it next to the first without comment, then went back outside to reset the hinge on the equipment shed. Eleanor turned the new envelope once, felt the thinness of it, and set it aside unopened like its twin. She didn't need to break the seal to know what it asked. Lang wanted confirmation she would stay away from the vote, and the wording would be polite enough on the surface, the way he'd always kept things when he needed the record clean. The phone rang while Thomas was still outside. It was the same secretary, her voice lower now, almost a whisper across the line. Lang moved the meeting up an hour. The item about the holding company asset is still on the agenda, but he's added a clause that any sensor data older than the current filings can't be introduced without the full board's consent first. Eleanor listened without interrupting. The secretary kept going, softer. Exhibit 3 still lines up, but if they vote the new clause through before the readings come in, it won't matter. After she hung up, the ridge wind picked up again, carrying the steady click of the sensors like a clock that refused to be hurried. Thomas came back in for coffee, left another reading sheet on the counter, and went out again. The numbers on this one matched the log she had already sent, right down to the decimal on the morning wind speed. By noon the tension had settled deeper, the kind that makes an old joint ache before the real weather hits. Eleanor moved the 2 envelopes an inch farther from the edge of the table so the light wouldn't glare on the seals. The photo corner still showed under the note the way it had since the package first arrived, its corner worn from being handled but never unfolded in front of anyone else. Thomas brought in one more sheet at lunch, the ink slightly smudged from his glove, and the match held again. That small alignment stayed in the room without anyone needing to name it. The board meeting now sat 12 hours away, and the rotary phone stayed quiet through the afternoon meal the same way it had the day before. Afternoon brought the next small pressure. A messenger, not the regular mail carrier, left a third envelope at the step, this one hand-delivered and marked for signature. Thomas signed for it without asking what it contained, then carried it inside and placed it beside the other 2. Eleanor looked at the stack of 3, felt the weight of the morning's decision not to open any of them, and left the third unopened as well. The photo corner remained visible under its note, the same physical reminder that had sat there through every previous reversal. The sensors kept their rhythm outside, and the countdown moved to 11 hours without any new word on the line. Thomas went back to the hinge repair, boots leaving another faint track of ridged dirt across the threshold, while Eleanor stayed at the table and let the unopened stack do its quiet work. 11 hours still sat on the clock when the light began to slant low across the ridge. You know how that kind of waiting settles into the bones after a while, it doesn't sharpen, it just thickens. Eleanor pushed the 3 envelopes another inch inward so the corner of the photo stayed shaded, then rose to check the old thermos. The coffee had gone lukewarm, but she poured what was left anyway and carried the cup out to Thomas at the hinge. He nodded without looking up, the way a man does when words would only crowd the work. By the time the sun touched the far line of hills, the tension had found a new place to press. The rotary phone gave its short, dry ring while Eleanor was rinsing the cup. She wiped her hands on the towel and answered on the second turn. A woman's voice, clipped and younger than it had any right to be, asked for confirmation that the final sensor logs would be ready before the meeting. The chairman wants them in hand, Mrs. Harlan. No exceptions. The line clicked off before Eleanor could answer. She set the receiver down and stood there a moment, listening to the wind against the screen door. Thomas came in from the porch, boots scraping the mat. He saw her face and didn't ask. Instead he picked up the newest reading sheet from the counter, the one with the morning wind speed still inked in his careful block letters, and laid it beside the envelopes. The match held again. That small fact sat between them like a hand on a shoulder. Outside the sensors kept their steady click, counting off another quarter hour. Evening brought the fresh pressure. A second messenger, this one in a county vehicle with the seal on the door, pulled up at the gate and waited. Thomas went out, signed the clipboard, and accepted the flat folder. Inside it, when he carried it to the table, was a single typed page on company letterhead requesting that all unregistered data sources be declared before the vote. The page was clipped to the back of a duplicate map of the ridge, the very one Eleanor had drawn by hand 30 years earlier when the first monitors went up. The photo corner under its note stayed exactly where it had been, the edge now slightly curled from the day's handling. She left that fourth item unopened too. The board meeting was 10 hours away, and the stack had grown heavy enough to hold its own silence. Thomas turned on the lamp above the sink, the bulb humming the way it always did when the nights turned cool. He went back to the hinge repair by that light, the small tap of the hammer keeping time with the sensors. Eleanor sat with the envelopes and let the unopened weight do what it had always done, remind her that some things survive being set aside. A little after 8 the phone rang again. This time it was the university lab, the one that had calibrated the original instruments. The voice on the other end sounded uncertain, almost apologetic. They had received a copy of the request for unregistered data sources, and wondered whether Eleanor wanted them to hold the archived charts from the early 1980s. She thanked them, said she would call back, and hung up. The receiver clicked into place softer than it had all day. Thomas looked over from the hinge but didn't speak. The photo corner showed another fraction of an inch when she adjusted the stack to make room for the new reading sheet he brought in at 9. Night settled over the ridge with the wind dropping just enough to let the sensors sound louder. 10 hours became 9, then 8, the numbers moving without ceremony. Eleanor washed the last cup, set it upside down on the drain board, and returned to the table. The envelopes remained exactly as she had left them, the visible photo corner catching the lamplight for a moment before she shifted the note to cover it again. Thomas finished the hinge, tested the door twice, and came to sit across from her. Neither of them opened anything. The stack stayed closed, the way it had through every earlier reversal, and the ridge kept its own quiet count toward morning. Now, you have to understand something about that ridge and the way the wind moved across it. Those sensors had been set by hand 39 years back, and Eleanor still knew every placement by the feel of the ground under her boots. The phone sat quiet for a stretch after the lab call, but the clock kept its own count. 7 hours left to the meeting. Thomas poured 2 fingers of water into a glass and set it beside her without a word. She nodded once, the way she always had when the night ran long at the old station house. A little past 10 the second call came through, this one from the county recorder's office. The woman on the line sounded young, the kind who read everything off a screen. She had a question about an old filing number that matched one of the envelopes still sitting unopened on the table. Eleanor listened, gave the exact parcel description without pulling the paper out, and said the data would be hand-delivered in the morning. The recorder's office thanked her, the line went dead, and the photo corner stayed right where it was, the note folded once more to keep the image from showing. Thomas asked only if she wanted the door checked again. She told him it was fine the way it stood. You could feel the weight in the room then, the same weight that had been there through every earlier night like this one. 6 hours now. Eleanor walked the short hall to the back room and came back with the logbook from the early runs, the pages stiff from cold storage. She didn't open the envelopes. Instead she set the log beside them and let the two stacks sit side by side, the familiar ruled columns next to the newer formal ones. The lamplight caught the edge of the photo corner again, just enough to show the curl growing deeper from the evening's handling. Thomas finished testing the repaired hinge and sat with his hands resting on the table edge. Midnight brought its own small reversal. The university lab rang once more, this time with a different voice, older. They said the archive charts had been pulled and cross-checked against the request for unregistered sources. The numbers lined up with the original calibration runs Eleanor herself had logged in 1983. She thanked them again, promised the board would have the full set by noon, and hung up. The receiver settled into place without any extra sound. The girl at the county office might still think the data belonged to someone else, but that one call had let another piece slip into place without anyone at the table knowing it yet. 5 hours left. Eleanor stood, stretched the stiffness from her shoulders the way a person does after decades of late shifts, and walked the floor once more. The sensors outside ticked their steady report through the open window. She returned to the table, shifted the note to cover the photo corner completely this time, and sat back down. Thomas rose only to refill the water glass. Neither of them spoke of what the morning would bring. The stack remained closed, the envelopes heavy with their own silence, and the ridge held its quiet line toward daylight. For hours now, and you could feel the ridge settling deeper into that pre-dawn quiet, the kind that comes after decades of watching the same line of trees hold against the wind. Eleanor shifted the note an inch so the photo corner stayed flat, its edge catching just enough lamplight to show the faint crease that had formed from all the turning. Thomas asked if she wanted the side window latched tighter against the draft. She shook her head once and let the question settle without an answer. The sensors kept their steady tick through the open frame, each click a small reminder of the runs that had started back when the equipment was still new and untested. Then the line rang again. This time it was the junior tech from the county office, the one who had sounded so certain hours earlier. She claimed the board had asked for a secondary verification and that any data tied to the 1983 calibration might need to be pulled from the active file. Eleanor listened without interrupting, then asked the girl to read the exact request number back. When the number matched the one Eleanor had written on the margin of the old logbook decades ago, the tech paused. She said the request would be held until morning, then hung up. The small reversal sat there between them like the photo under the note, nothing dramatic, just another piece sliding into its place without anyone at the county office realizing whose name had once been on the original forms. Thomas stood and walked the floor the way a man does when he has spent a lifetime checking locks before a storm. 3.5 hours. The envelope stayed closed on the table, their weight unchanged, while the ridge outside held its single dark line against the coming light. Eleanor reached for the logbook again but did not open it. Instead she traced one ruled column with a fingertip, the paper stiff from years in the cold storage drawer, and you could almost hear the old runs coming back in the silence, the ones where she had stayed through every shift because no one else knew how to set the baseline without drift. The new mini-crisis arrived at 3 hours sharp. A flicker ran through the sensors, then the main line went dead for 8 full seconds before the backup kicked in with a low hum that filled the room. Thomas checked the fuse box by the back door and found nothing blown, but the timing was too close to morning to ignore. Eleanor picked up the receiver anyway, dialed the emergency number for the Ridge station, and spoke only long enough to confirm the outage had been logged at the source. When she set the phone down, the girl from the county office had already called back on the secondary line. This time the tone had changed. She asked whether Eleanor still held any original field notes from the unregistered period, the ones the board might need if the auction moved forward at noon. Eleanor answered that the notes were where they had always been. She did not offer to send them. The line went quiet after that, the kind of quiet that leaves a question hanging for the person who asked it. 2 hours left. Thomas refilled the water glass without being asked and placed it beside the logbook. Neither of them moved the note that covered the photo corner. The ridge stayed steady, the sensors settled back into their rhythm, and the stack of envelopes waited with the same closed patience it had shown since the first ring. Eleanor stood once more, stretched the stiffness from her shoulders the way she had after every late shift back when the station was still hers to run, and walked the short hall to the window. Outside, the first pale edge of daylight touched the tree line. She returned to the table, sat down, and let the next hour begin without any promise of what the board would say when the envelopes finally opened. 1 hour and 40 minutes left on the clock when the secondary line rang again, this time from the auction house itself. The man on the other end introduced himself as a clerk processing the final bids and asked, in that careful voice people use when they already know the answer, whether Eleanor could confirm the chain of custody on the Ridge data logs. She told him the logs had never left the station. He thanked her and hung up without pressing further, but the pause before he spoke again told her the question had come from higher up. Thomas cleared his throat once, the way he did when he wanted to say something without crowding her. She nodded toward the glass he had refilled earlier. He took the hint and stayed quiet. Outside, the light had climbed enough to show the frost still clinging to the lower branches. Inside, the sensors kept their steady tick, each one feeding numbers into the old recorder that had been recalibrated by hand more times than either of them could count anymore. The note over the photo corner stayed exactly where she had left it, its corner tucked under the corner of the logbook so the wind from the door would not lift it. Every now and then her eyes drifted there, not to move it, just to remember the weight of the paper against her thumb the night she had written the single line across the top. 40 minutes later the Ridge station called back on its own. A new voice, younger, asked whether anyone at the house could authorize a temporary reroute of the feed while they tested a replacement board at the substation. Eleanor asked who had ordered the test. The voice said the county office. She asked for a name. The voice gave one she did not recognize. She told him to hold the reroute until she called the station chief herself. The line went quiet, then the same voice came back and said the chief was unavailable. Eleanor thanked him and set the receiver down without raising her voice. Thomas watched the needles on the main panel settle again. The flicker from earlier had not returned, but the margin was thinner now, and the low hum of the backup felt louder in the room than it had at 3. She stood, walked the same short hall to the window, and this time stayed long enough to watch a single crow lift from the fence line and disappear into the trees. When she came back, the logbook page in front of her still showed the same column of numbers she had copied at midnight. 20 minutes to the opening of the envelopes. The girl from the county office called once more, this time on the main line, and asked if Eleanor would consider releasing the unregistered notes under a temporary seal so the board could review them before the bids were read aloud. Eleanor asked what the seal would cover. The girl said the original baseline measurements and any handwritten corrections. Eleanor answered that the corrections had already been logged at the source. The girl hesitated, then said the board would prefer to see them in the original handwriting. Eleanor repeated that the notes were where they had always been and set the phone down before the girl could ask again. Thomas reached across the table and straightened the edge of the note without lifting it. The photo corner stayed covered. The room held the same closed quiet it had held since the first call of the morning, only now the light through the window had reached the far edge of the table and touched the corner of the top envelope in the stack. Eleanor sat back in the chair she had used for every late shift since the station opened, rested her hands on the arms, and waited for the next ring. And here's where the margin thinned even more, right there in that same room. The next call came on the direct line from the county surveyor's office, and the man on the other end didn't bother with any pleasantries. He said the board had decided the baseline figures looked incomplete without the original field notes, and they wanted Eleanor to fax the whole stack over before the envelopes were opened. She asked him to hold while she checked the log again, even though she already knew what it said. Thomas turned the main panel volume down a notch so the hum wouldn't carry into the receiver. When she came back on the line, she told the surveyor the notes stayed at the station, the same way they had for every other bid cycle since the place opened. The man tried one more time, mentioning temporary administrative access, and Eleanor thanked him for the call before she set the receiver down. The photo corner stayed exactly where it was under the edge of the logbook. You have to picture the light moving across that table, slow and steady, while the clock on the wall ticked past the 20-minute mark and kept going. The auction itself was still a full day and a half away, but the county was already treating the envelopes like they could open them early if the paperwork looked thin. Eleanor stood again, walked the short hall, and this time the crow was back on the fence line, watching the window the way it had for the past 3 winters. She stayed long enough to see it lift once and settle again before she returned to her chair. Thomas had straightened the top envelope so its corner sat square with the others. The needles on the backup gauge held steady, but the margin between the primary line and the floor reading had narrowed by another 2 points since the last check. The girl from the county office called again on the main line, this time with a different request. She said the board needed to compare the handwritten corrections against the printed baseline before any bids were read, and they were prepared to send a courier if Eleanor would initial the temporary release form. Eleanor asked what the courier would carry back to the board. The girl said only the corrections page, nothing else. Eleanor answered that the corrections had been copied into the log at midnight and the original sheet stayed in the drawer where it belonged. The girl paused, then asked if Eleanor understood the board could delay the entire opening if the notes weren't provided. Eleanor said she understood, set the receiver down, and watched the light reach the second envelope in the stack. Thomas cleared his throat once, the way he always did when a small problem had solved itself without anyone else noticing. The low hum from the backup settled into the same steady tone it had held at 3 that morning. Eleanor rested her hands on the chair arms again and waited. Outside, the crow lifted a second time and disappeared into the trees before the next rain could come. The photo corner stayed covered, the same way it had through every late shift since the station opened, and the numbers in the logbook column still matched the ones she had written at midnight. The girl didn't call back after that. Eleanor stayed in the chair while the light moved across the desk and touched the third envelope. Thomas didn't speak, but he set a mug of coffee beside her hand the way he had every night shift since the station opened in 1978. The coffee was always the same, strong, no sugar, served without asking. Outside, the branches held still. The backup gauge kept its line steady. By morning the courier never arrived, and the board convened at 10 without the corrections page. Eleanor walked the short hall once more, watched the crow return to the fence, then put on her coat and drove the old pickup into town. Seat 3B at the county annex still had the torn vinyl she remembered from the original lease hearing. The room held the same 8 people who had told her 6 months earlier that her records were outdated and not required for modern valuation. The young man in the county chair, the one who'd spoken those words, wore the same pressed blazer and the same wristwatch that caught the light when he gestured. He looked at her now the way he had then, polite, finished, already moving on. The bids were opened one by one. The first 2 came in low. The third carried a figure that made the room shift in its chairs. Eleanor waited until they reached the final envelope, the one with the handwritten margin notes she had copied at midnight. When the clerk read the baseline against her corrections, the numbers no longer matched the printed sheet. The clerk stopped. The young man asked for the original log. Eleanor set it on the table, open to the page she had initialed at 3 in the morning. The margin between primary and floor reading had narrowed exactly as the backup gauge had shown. That margin meant the aquifer held an extra 600 acre-feet no one had counted on. The room went quiet while the clerk re-added the figures. The young man's blazer suddenly looked too new for the room. He cleared his throat the way men do when they realize they have spoken too soon. He asked if she understood what the revised valuation would mean for the sale. Eleanor answered that she had understood it since the station was built on land she had deeded to the county only on the condition that she keep the gauges running. The deed clause had sat in a drawer for 46 years because no one had bothered to read past the first page. She had kept the original. He asked her to step outside with him. In the hallway, where the others couldn't hear, he said he had treated her records as an old woman's habit. He said he had been wrong and that the mistake was his alone. Eleanor nodded once. She told him the crow on the fence line had watched the same window every winter since the station opened, and it had never needed a new coat to know when the light changed. Then she went back inside. When the final bid was accepted, the clerk read her name as the station's original operator and the one whose logs had protected the true volume. The young man stood at the lectern and said the board's earlier dismissal had been based on incomplete review. He used her full name. He said the county owed her the respect of having listened the first time. The others at the table looked at him, then at her, and no one reached for another envelope. After the meeting, Eleanor drove back before the light faded. Thomas had left the coffee mug on the desk and the log open to the midnight entry. The photo corner under the glass still showed the corner of the girl in the red sweater, the one taken the week the station began reading. The crow settled on the fence once more. She watched it lift and disappear into the trees, the same motion it had made every winter since the first gauge was bolted down. Years later the station kept its steady line. The county sent the quarterly reports to her door instead of asking for corrections. The young man, older now, stopped by once with a letter the board had written acknowledging the original deed. He left it on the desk without asking her to sign anything further. Thomas still brought the coffee. The envelopes were never needed again. What stayed with Eleanor was the simple fact that the work had been done the same way for decades: quiet checks at midnight, steady lines on a gauge, a crow that returned because nothing had changed enough to drive it off. Some people spend a lifetime keeping records no one reads until the day the numbers matter more than the coat someone wears. The rest of us just hope the light reaches the right envelope before the board closes the drawer.